I'm really pleased to welcome you to our last lecture of our Fall Visiting Artist Lecture Series at Hartwick College, titled Diverse Perspectives. I'm Stephanie Rosine. I am an Associate Professor of Art here at Hartwick, and it's my distinct pleasure tonight to introduce to you Christina Hunt-Wood. Christina uses found objects, video, and photography to explore her rural, predominantly white community's relationship with race and everyday expressions of power. Christina lives in the Catskill Mountains of New York. She received her MFA in Visual Arts from Lesley University Art and Design and earned a BA in Studio Art from Hobart William Smith Colleges. Wood has exhibited most recently her work at the Fenimore Museum of Art in Cooperstown, New York, Target Gallery in Alexandria, Virginia, and the Painting Center in New York City. Additionally, she is the co-founder of Get Woke film series and Conversations on Race, an organization that uses art and film as a vehicle for exploring race locally and nationally. In 2019, she was named a Steward of the Catskills by the Catskills Center for Commitment to Anti-Racism Work in the region. And tonight, more about her work. So I will turn things over to her for her talk, The Collected Evidence, Art, Activism, and Rural Culture.
Thanks so much, Stephanie and Leah and the rest of the art department and art history department at Hartwick College. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak. I'll be speaking for about a half hour and then we'll have questions. So let's get started. The writer Sarah Ahmed talks about the feminist snap in her book, Living a Feminist Life. She says that as children, our backgrounds and history orient us to the future. We inherit the pressure to maintain long-held beliefs and traditions passed on by family, community, and country. In doing so, our loved ones and trusted leaders assure us that we'll attain happiness, success. Of course, this happiness is relative to the power structures that define it. For example, what's going on here? Always a technical issue. There we go. My grandmother, Marjorie, attended Syracuse University for music education in the early 1940s. This was one of the few careers a woman could aspire to then. She taught music for a short while, married my grandfather, who was the local veterinarian. They bought a beautiful home in Stamford, which is about a half hour from the Hartwick College campus. And socially, my grandmother was active in the Methodist Church, a member of the Order of the Eastern Star, a women-inclusive branch of the Freemasons. And when my grandfather's veterinary practice took off, he needed a secretary. So my grandmother left her career and worked from home in an office managing paperwork and answering calls and greeting patients. Being a secretary, a support for male success, was another acceptable career for women in the 1950s and 60s. Working from home also made it more efficient for her to keep a clean, comfortable house, prepare meals, and raise her two children, my mom and uncle. By 1950s standards, they had achieved the American dream. Happiness, right? My grandmother played her part, but was she truly happy? Was she whole? Evidence would say no. I found out several years ago that my grandmother, who passed away in 1990, was abusing Valium for much of her adult life. For those of you who don't know, this drug was charmingly nicknamed Mother's Little Helper and was abused by countless housewives in the 60s and 70s to calm their moods, perhaps an insurance for women to remain in character and not jeopardize the status quo, their happiness. But what happens when you don't take the pills and you have enough anger and evidence and clarity to see that the status quo is really normalized inequity, a pathology that's been passed on through generations to fortify the rights of some and minimize the rights of others? Well, you might snap. You might yell at your partner, your parents, you might leave the situation and sever ties, you might write about it, you might paint about it, you might take to the streets. My snap propelled me toward activism in both my art practice and in my role that I play in my community. Tonight, I'll discuss the mobilizing factors, the collecting of evidence, and my art and activism. In June 2015, a self-identified white supremacist murdered 9 Black Bible study attendees at Mother Emanuel AME Church in Charleston, South Carolina. As details of the attack unfolded, so did social media images of the perpetrator posing with the Confederate flag. For many South Carolinians, in that moment, the correlation between racialized violence and symbols like the Confederate flag was very clear. Thousands protested on the Capitol, demanding the flag be removed from the State House. And in July of 2015, South Carolina's House of Representatives voted 94-20 in favor of the flag's removal. But nearly 850 miles north, here in rural upstate New York, Confederate flags began springing up in solidarity with jilted Southerners who opposed the flag's removal in South Carolina. As someone whose maternal descendants immigrated to the area 6 generations prior, it troubled me to think that fellow locals would embrace Southern Confederate pride when our ancestors had likely fought with Union forces in the Civil War. And as a Black person, I found it pretty sobering that people in my community would rally behind a symbol of white supremacy amidst a national tragedy. That same summer, several New York State fair organizers had pledged to ban or discourage the sale of Confederate flags at their events. But when the board of directors at the Delaware County Fair, my county fair, were asked by a local reporter if they'd follow suit, members replied, "The Civil War got over 153 years ago, and it's just a part of history." And one person said, "The more of them, the better." It felt like a slap in the face. But what was even worse were the white friends and family members who simplified the surge of Confederate flags in our rural, predominantly white community as freedom of speech, or suggested I was overreacting when I expressed concern. I was suddenly very aware that in this majority white space, where many enjoyed the benefits of whiteness, it was easy to fool oneself into believing that their community didn't have a problem with racism, that committing psychological violence rooted in actual violence against Black people was protected under the Constitution, that staying out of it and maintaining the status quo would feel better than empathizing with someone perceived as a racial outsider, someone challenging their culture. Over 50 years ago, the writer James Baldwin said, "To be a Negro in this country and to be relatively conscious is to be in a constant rage almost all the time." While I had felt this rage for much of my life, I didn't have words for it until 2015. In my art practice, this event moved me away from figure painting, and I began dealing with the subject of racism. Initially, I began documenting myself in a range of emotions, which helped me process the feelings I had for my community, feelings complicated by my biracial and local identity. I was raised in this white world by white people who saw me as exotic and articulate and called me different from other Blacks as they compared me to demonizing portrayals that they saw on TV. But clearly, they didn't see the version of our world that I saw, which was becoming increasingly more comfortable with overt racism again. No doubt, my people loved me and often assured me that they didn't see race. It meant they didn't see the name calling and feel the impact of the Confederate flags. They didn't need to check their language or assumptions because they had decided that they weren't racist from within a void. At that moment, I hated them for their willful ignorance, and I loved them still because they were my people. So I'm going to go back to my grandmother. Um, After my grandmother died in 2010, we found one of my grandmother's photo albums from the period right before she got married to my grandfather. Inside the album was a photo of her on the right in the gingham dress, standing beside a group of people in blackface. My response then was disgusted amusement. I knew where I lived. Rural northern communities loved their minstrel shows, and they actually performed them through the 1940s pretty regularly. This one, I learned later, was a fundraiser for the Bloomville Church to buy a new furnace. In 2015, following my snap, I knew that this photo and my relationship to my grandmother must be taken more seriously and integrated into the thesis of my work. At first, I borrowed from the photo to develop a blackface character, one that breaks the fourth wall and confronts you, the viewer, in despair and anger. I was interested in forcing the viewer to acknowledge me as a Black person responding to racial violence in the US. But it became clear that the intensity of the work might deter white audiences I sought to communicate with. I would likely be immediately tuned out. I needed to alter my visual language in a way that was nuanced if I wanted to retain attention of fragile white audiences. I looked at artists like Ken Gonzalez-Day and Deborah Luster for examples of work that handled potentially triggering topics in a more nuanced way. Gonzalez-Day's series, Erased Lynchings, removes the victim from the archival photo of Western lynchings and leaves the perpetrators to be scrutinized. By removing the victim, the image allows a viewer to look longer without wanting to turn away. And to look longer ideally leads to more consideration of the image's meaning. In Deborah Luster's work, she created an archive of locations where killings occurred in New Orleans, but long after the fact. With each image, Luster includes a corpus detailing the violence that occurred at that location. In experiencing this archive in its entirety of 200 images, one can't help but recognize a massive cultural problem without having to be traumatized or allow the victim to be exploited further. I explored this more nuanced approach and became an anthropologist of sorts. I tried to set aside my emotions and focus narrowly on my community and its relationship with race. I started the process by collecting evidence, which included objects, memories, archives, and personal observations. Through this exercise, patterns formed and acted as a vehicle for my practice. I drove around the region, photographing homes displaying the Confederate flag. This action was part confrontation, burning off any remaining emotions, and it was part documentation. In graduate school, one of my mentors, film producer Althea Wasso, had encouraged me to look longer than I'm supposed to. So I did. These segregationist symbols are meant to shut down any hope for cultural intervention. They're meant to deter Black people from sticking around long enough to be victimized. In my documentation, I used my privilege as a deeply embedded local person to look long and hard at these messages. I photographed each site with a very conspicuous Canon DSLR camera, and I used the same treatment at the county fair in 2016. At the event, there were over a dozen vendors who made the segregationist symbol the centerpiece of their booths. Using images, audio, and video footage obtained from that shoot, I created a short documentary entitled County Fair. And the practice of looking longer gave me a more objective eye. In organizing the collected evidence, I started to seek out other rebellious and relatively mundane actions that captured the spirit of our local culture. One day it hit me: spent road sodas. Beer cans consumed while driving and then tossed into the ditches of back roads. I began documenting them in their natural habitat. The series, called The Rural Archive, is typically displayed on vinyl floor tiles. Eventually, this work morphed into the collecting, deconstruction, and creation of panels using the actual road soda litter. Each panel represents a specific road and are what I consider maps, an idea borrowed from Deborah Luster's aforementioned series, Tooth for an Eye, a choreography of violence. Choreography, not choreography, is defined as a subjective mapping or representation of space or place. Using the collected evidence, objects, archives, and interviews, I also made 2 video reenactments. Oh, let me hop along here. 2 video reenactments based on relatively everyday racialized events. The first, Oh the Measure, looks at my father's first interaction with my grandmother in the 1970s. In an interview with my mother, she explained that to ease my grandmother's racial discomfort, which she had a lot of, my dad did cartwheels and told my grandmother that she was beautiful. It made me think about how, in a society organized by white supremacy, we all perform parts. In her role, my grandmother must establish dominance by not trusting Black people, and a Black person, such as my father, must prove he is not a threat. In the video, I lean into the blackface minstrel show photo found at my grandmother's house, and I created Oh the Measures, which is rooted in the silent film minstrel genre. I incorporated the sound of beer cans and bottles being tossed from the vehicle as a way to shorten the distance between the past and present and draw attention to the jarring impact of an action that's often dismissed as innocuous. And I do have the video here, and I'm hoping that the sound will work for us properly. Give me a, Stephanie, if you'll give me a,
Christina, if you go up to your Zoom menu, under more ... it'll give you an option to share computer volume or share computer audio, and I think that is going to be helpful.
can you hear it at all? Or not? Because I have to pop out
I can hear it
of
in the
the
very
Zoom.
background, very, very faintly.
It's very low.
Okay.
I've also seen it before, so I know what to hear, look for, or listen for.
Okay. I think I have to pop out of
Okay.
the if you don't mind.
That's fine.
So where do I go?
It actually,
Leah?
you have to do it while you're sharing your screen.
Oh, how do I do that? Share screen.
And then when your screen is shared, you'll see a menu roll over, like on the top where it says you're sharing your screen.
On the wrong thing, aren't I? Oh gosh. Okay, hold on a sec. I'm gonna go here. Share screen. Do you see the slideshow?
Yes.
Okay. And then where do I go? I'm sorry.
Roll over on the
oh,
top, just
I
leave
see.
your mouse up there,
Yep.
pointer, and then a menu should come down, and then it'll say more ... You see that?
I have an audio settings. Is that
It'll say share computer audio.
audio? Secret audio device.
I think it should be up at the top.
Yeah, I'm not sure what's happening here. So under the audio, I'm going to the drop down. There's not a more. So are you on an Apple and I'm on a PC? Is that what's a language barrier
I
happening?
think it should just be Zoom, the Zoom app. And it's not under audio, it's just under more ... when you roll up there.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Does that help?
It helps a lot.
Yay. Okay, good.
I'm a bad listener, everybody. I want you to all know, bad listener.
No, that's okay. I'm glad you found it. Okay, so you found the share computer
Yeah,
audio.
okay, let's try this again, everybody. I apologize for the delay.
No worries at all.
I'm learning something new with Zoom every day.
There it is.
By the light of the silvery moon, I want to my honey I'll soon love. Come the moon, keep a shining in June. Your silvery beams will bring love dreams into cuddling soon.
In Racial Tensions, the third video in the series, I recreate an incident where a group of local high school boys began embracing Wu-Tang Clan culture. They experienced significant pushback from an opposing group of boys that called themselves the Hicks, and from the school's administration. In this piece, I draw attention to how the cultural intervention that's perceived as other can be shut down in favor of a white dominant status quo, even when the intervention is led by local white people. In my work, I use evidence from the present and past as a way to connect our current reality. I look at the recurring themes of white supremacy that have always been here, using the personal stories of my own family and friends, along with archives, objects, and observations. I try to construct a picture of our culture and call attention to aggressions that may feel so commonplace we don't even notice them. In 2017, following the release of my video County Fair, I was introduced to a few people who had watched it and had been independently pressuring the Delaware County Fair Board to disallow the sale of Confederate flags since the 2015 incident. One couple was conducting a writing campaign, and the other was a former volunteer at the fair's 4-H rabbit barn who had resigned due to the issue. She had shared the story with her media contacts, giving Little Delaware County national attention through the New York Times. She had connections. We quickly realized that we should be working together and unifying our varied skill set. So we met over brunch one Sunday afternoon in July of 2017 and decided to organize a press conference for the opening day of the fair in mid-August. Our goals were to announce the beginning of our campaign to rid the fair of the Confederate flag, do so in a way that showcased the fun and inclusion that we expected from a family-friendly event, and to provide a vehicle for community members to come together and speak against normalization of white supremacy in our community. While I'm a practicing artist, like many, I have a day job, which is in marketing and graphic design. So I use these skills to create the Fair for All brand and logo. And I had some fun painting signs that read things like "Raise goats, not racists," "Move that flag out of here," and "Cluck the Confederacy." We ordered colorful balloons with our logo printed on them and brought a wagon decorated to carry a small PA system for speakers to use. Also, we invited 2 photographers to document the press conference and inform the press. Each of us had invited our members from our networks to join us, and about 50 people came, which was a pretty decent turnout for an anti-racism activity in a rural red community in 2017. Speakers included a local pastor, a historian, a member of the Oneonta NAACP, myself, and Leslie, the former rabbit barn supervisor. Also, we had in our possession a letter, which was signed by 600 regional fairgoers asking organizers to disallow the sale of the racist symbol, like other retailers had, including Walmart and Amazon. In a very disturbing turn of events, the evening before, Heather Heyer, a counter-protester at the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, Virginia, was mowed down by a violent white supremacist. That was the rally where protesters marched with torches, Nazi and Confederate flags, and chanted anti-Semitic and racist slogans. For us, the violence in Charlottesville was just more evidence that we were on the path that we needed to be following. And we hoped, although had little faith, that our fair organizers would accept our letter and its demands signed by so many. We hoped that they would take into consideration that yet another hateful act occurred under the Confederate flag and add a policy to their vendor contracts. One that would say Delaware County Fair does not support profiteering from hate. But after the press conference, we marched into the fairgrounds with our balloons and instruments to deliver the letter to the office, and we were stopped by staff and several board members who had arrived by golf cart. They tried to block the entry to the public event and even called to the state troopers who were watching from the sidelines to have us arrested. We delivered the letter, were not arrested, and sadly, we also made no headway with the fair organizers. But we knew that this would be a challenging campaign, and this was the birth of our anti-racism movement. The public response to our action was interesting. We were called a hate group at one point, accused of changing history somehow. Many people in my circle remained silent, and one stood up for a friend on the fair board, claiming, "So-and-so isn't racist, he's a good guy." A couple people told us that there were better ways to go to get this done, better ways than upsetting the fair board leadership. But each of us and others had reached out to no avail. In fact, the only response we got was the more Confederate flags, the better, 2 years prior. Martin Luther King Jr. says in his letter from Birmingham jail, we know through painful experience that freedom is never voluntarily given by the oppressor. It must be demanded by the oppressed. Frankly, I have yet to engage in a direct action campaign that was well timed in the view of those who have not suffered unduly from the disease of segregation. You know, one of our major takeaways from this experience was that many people in our community did not understand the system of racism and how they might play a part in protecting it through avoidance, denial, or anger. In response, we formed Get Woke, an organization committed to demystifying racism by using the arts as a vehicle for potentially uncomfortable conversations. We wanted to create a space for well-meaning folks to investigate the intricacies of a racist society together and talk about how we might become better citizens. If we truly wanted a more inclusive community, we would need to understand where we've been historically and how it impacts who we are now. Also, we needed to develop a language and confidence to speak in plain terms so we could effectively challenge the mythologies taught in schools about melting pots in the land of the free. And we needed to stop calling genocide and land theft a discovery and effect change from the microcosm of our rural backyards. Programs such as film screenings, artist talks, and lectures took place primarily on the SUNY Delhi campus from 2017 to 2020, and were supported by several local organizations that included a church, an arts group, a college history club, and most recently, an economic and community development organization. Each event we hosted brought about 30 to 50 attendees, and for us, narrowing the division between the college and local communities, the young and the old, the black and white, felt like a huge success. But alas, COVID hit, and it uprooted our plans for the remainder of 2020. Still, we stayed in touch with our Get Woke friends via social media, and together we watched as police violence against Black bodies escalated across the United States. Cities across America took to the streets, and we knew that we must come together too, to mourn and to speak out and to scream from the rooftop that Black lives matter. Over the past few years, we had built a coalition that was no longer afraid to stand in public, demanding accountability from institutions running rampant with injustice, even in our very red conservative community. To organize an action, a small group of us met on a Tuesday to discuss details for an event that would be scheduled for that Saturday. Now, in my art practice, I have had success presenting evidence in meaningful ways and using visual language as a tool for highlighting expressions of power. But in my work, I'm also drawn to the concept of awe and resonance, which is to say, making something that has the power to stop the viewer in their tracks and want to sit with a piece and think about it deeply. Work that has visual bang, but is nuanced and layered and allows narrative to unfold. This approach can be applied to direct action with impactful results. Through our Black Lives Matter event in Delhi, the county seat of Delaware County, we sought to speak firmly about the measures necessary for our communities to be better allies and challengers of the diseased status quo. To force people to consider the collective impact of racialized police violence, we staked over 30 Black and white images into the ground. Into the ground on the village green at the foot of a monument dedicated to those who fought and died in the Civil War, a battle that supposedly freed Black people. We asked attendees to bring flowers and other perishable offerings to lay at the foot of the images. Also, we chose a gazebo located across the square as a stage for remarks. This focal point screams perfect little American town, and was even captured in a painting by Stephen DeHanos on Independence Day in 1951 for the cover of the Saturday Evening Post. On the stage, we called into question whether our community was in fact perfect. Our rally, which was called Honoring Black Lives, was expected to draw about 150 people. but over 700 people showed up to stand in solidarity with Black lives and to be a part of what I called a living monument. From the gazebo that day, I said, "Today, we are here first and foremost to honor Black lives. Ahmaud Arbery's, Breonna Taylor's, George Floyd's, and so many others. But we're also here to condemn the racist systems of power guilty of devaluing and destroying Black bodies in the name of white supremacy. Most egregiously, our law enforcement and justice systems, but also our schools, our government, churches, and even our county fair. We're here as a monument to Black lives, and we're here to mourn, but we must also be here to take an oath that we will do the uncomfortable work of looking racism straight in the eye, that will reflect on our own participation within a system built around white supremacy." After the remarks, attendees lined the street of Delhi and the main street of Delhi with their signs in hand and socially distanced and taking up a lot of space along the entirety of the village to demand equity. And I have a little bit, it's a very short video of what it kind of felt like that day. So for much of my life, I was pretty quiet about the impact that everyday racism had on me. My typical responses were internal, and um, they were in the form of an eye roll or a clenched jaw. I just didn't have the language to challenge what was happening half the time, but I knew I was experiencing a different version of the world than my white friends and family members from a fairly young age. To snap, to speak up against racialized status quo would put my position as an acceptable Black friend or neighbor or employee at risk and thrust me into the unknown. But after my 2015 experience, what I found was, yes, I lost people along this journey. But in the meantime, I've developed a language that has inspired curiosity and conversations and self-reflection. And I've tried to do this from a place of evidence, logic, and compassion. Our anti-racism movement started with 4 people eating brunch, grew to 50 people delivering a letter, and shocked us with 700 people putting their bodies on the line to proclaim that Black Lives Matter. Yes, a snap might thrust you into the unknown, but for me, it made me whole, and it brought me to a new community of people who were at least trying to see me and other BIPOC people in their entirety. So thank you. And I just want to quickly also, um, I have a little last slide, but Davion Price, I want to acknowledge him. He was a friend of mine, and he was also a Hartwick alumni. So I just wanted to remember him. He passed away very suddenly last year. So Delaware County kid, Hartwick, a Hartwick student or alumni, and played the role of my father in Oh the Measures. So just wanted to share that. Okay.
Great, thank you, Christina. That was really wonderful. Thanks for sharing that work with us. So I'd like to open up for discussion. If you have a question, you can either type into the chat, I have a question, or you can type that question in and I'll read it and ask it to Christina. So we'll open it up to questions.
No questions?
No questions. Sometimes it takes a few minutes for folks to kind of gather their thoughts. You said it all, you know, you're just brilliant, that's all. So I'll start a question. So this fall series of ours has been about focusing on artists who have different diverse perspectives. And we had the pleasure of having artist named Jefferson Pinder speak with us a few weeks, maybe over a month ago. And his work is also speaks very specifically to sort of the histories of Black bodies and atrocities that have happened to those people. But he was really specific about not wanting to call himself an activist. He said that it's more powerful to call himself an artist, and I'll allow the work to speak about the truths. And so you're calling yourself an artist and an activist. And I think that here you sort of presented almost two veins of that. Can you speak a little bit to whether the activist is also the artist, or how that overlap might happen? That may be a tricky question. Are those two separate things for you? Do you feel that it's, where do you sit with that?
To some extent, they're separate, because I think partially because the people that I collaborate with are not artists, but they are activists. And I don't always like being called an activist, but I realize like this is what I'm doing. I'm also a community organizer. Like when I think of Get Woke, I usually think of it more as like organizing and community building than activism. And that like the work we did with Fair for All is much more activist based. As a visual artist, I tend to be more nuanced, a little more subtle. I you know, and I use some of those tools in my activism work. Like the fact that I'm drawn to. We're going to use the evidence. We're going to have a visual impact at this event. It's not just us standing on a corner with signs, but it's like 30 plus images that are like just so under the shadow of this monument. And like creating a scene with the Fair for All, like making sure just using color and using this energy. It's somewhat performative, but it is still activism, right? Like we're still standing up with signs and stating like the things that we're. So I mean, I think I tend to like put myself in different little like boxes.
Mm-hmm.
I would like to make them kind of converge at some point a little bit more. And I imagine they will. I feel like they will. They get closer and closer. I will tell you that.
Great. Yeah. I mean, I would imagine there's less of someone calling the county sheriff if it's considered art than if it's considered activism.
Right.
Right. That's an interesting distinction. We have a question from Stephanie Brunetta in the chat. She says, thank you for sharing your family history and the evolution of your work. Do you see your role as part historian?
I do a little bit, but I certainly that's a good question. Do I see myself as a historian? I think I do, but I struggle to like give myself that designation. I think that I push against the true historians in my community and around me to kind of like really start considering what might be missing and what we're not looking at. Like as I look at my, that photo of my grandmother, like, that is something that is not necessarily showcased or discussed at like, history club meetings, at the Historical Association or whatever. I don't know if that exists, but I mean, there's a story that I won't get into, but so after I presented that photo to the public and we figured out through the Historical Association what the photo was, when it was from, and who had photographed it, which was a very well-known photojournalist from Delaware County called Robert Wire. His name was Robert Wire. And so they tried to display it after I had found it and sort of like, brought it to the attention at a location that I will not mention. And it was hung, but it was removed the next day because, people got really triggered. So I think it's prompted people to want to go there and have these discussions. So while I'm doing some historical stuff, I don't know that I'm the historian. Does that answer? That answers your question.
She says, historians correct the record. So, right. And it's also a little bit about sort of documentation, right? Or to uncover these other things, right? And to tell different stories.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah, and there's actually, it's really fascinating. I could go on and on about this, but during my graduate school days, I spent a lot of time at the Delaware County Historical Association, and there was a woman, and her name is escaping me right now. I apologize. And she actually started working on history of African Americans in Delaware County. So there was some movement, but she passed away 10 years ago. And it was um, very like, the years that these people lived here and like, very technical information mostly. There were some families that she could get a little bit more narrative about. But when I started researching at the Historical Association, the archivist was like, here's a box. Like, I don't know what's in it, but here's stuff. And so I did have like a jump start that allowed me to kind of go through and find, you know, things that spoke to me for my work.
Great. So we have a question from someone who'd like to remain anonymous, and they're saying that they see a lot of parallels in their home community, being mostly white, red, and openly racist. How do you recommend standing up for the majority of your neighborhood, especially when they openly place symbols of hate, including Confederate flags and ropes and trees, in response to the Black Lives Matter movement? How do you handle being the only one?
You're not the only one. This is what I have learned. And I think that, for me, I felt like I was the only one at the beginning of my process in many ways. And I, through other organizing efforts, like I met those people who had seen the video and wanted to work with me. And it was a small group of people. It was just a couple people. And we said, how can we do better? And I think that, finding somebody, even if it's in your county or in the town next door, who shares the same kind of concerns, connecting with them. And then it kind of like there's it expands, like you know these people, they know these people, and then it can just kind of expand that you're maybe having reading groups together and really getting to understand your local history and relationship with race and the common themes that we need to be looking at in order to move ahead, like the racial gaps and things like that. And why is this area so white? What was redlining like in the town of Sydney or wherever. So I think just starting small and with a couple people, and then and just investigating together. And I do think that there are more people that are afraid to speak up, and then when they see that there are other people, they're more apt to speak up, and it just kind of grows. I mean, we were shocked when 700 people plus showed up at that rally. We were like, what? Like, but the climate had gotten so hot, but also people had been working and learning how to speak to the issues, and they were recognizing their friends speaking to the issues, and it just kind of grew. It grows.
Great. So we have a question from Karen Rowe. Do you feel that the role of art is to act as a reflection of our lives and our history?
Good question. I do. I think it's such an important document in kind of like understanding periods of time. Like, I mean, you look at a painting, you look at a Caravaggio painting, and you relate it to what came before and what came after, and you see the the way he's leaning into more human, like the human figure rather than godly figures, and like that's like all the culture of that time. It's like all there. So like even now, like we don't even sometimes know what we're doing, like as contemporary artists, as far as like how impactful maybe our capturing of the moment is. But I think it's totally one way to document the world that we live in.
So Christina, can you talk a little bit about, the work of this sort of community organizer activist is really about engaging public. And then when we look at the venues and the spaces in which we traditionally see art, those are, as my son pops in here, those spaces are sometimes closed off to the communities that might benefit from sitting deeply and with time to focus on that work. So how do you address getting your art practice and your pieces in front of the community members who might be willing to sit and sort of deeply consider them as a part of a conversation.
Right. So one of the things that I want to do more of is playing with video and being able to like make things accessible through that medium. The panels, like these panels really were like designed for Art World because while they're talking about like rural issues and you know, people who, there's this mentality of like, you can't tell me what to do, so I'm going to drink and drive, I'm going to also chuck my beer out the window, this is like my land where I grew up. And while I want to talk to those people about like you know, what role they're playing in like perpetuating sort of like negativity in on our environment, and perhaps, you know, white supremacy, I don't know that they're going to listen to me anyway. But for me, you know, deconstructing these and putting them on panels and making them for Art World is a way that I can have conversations with, you know, a lot of my friends and well-meaning white people who are who look at it and say, oh, and then you know, like there's this conversation that I have with people where it starts with beer cans and you know, everyday expressions of power that become like Confederate flags, and how people, you know, sort of pass by them and allow them to be, and don't really like, you know, question when the vendor at the mall is selling Confederate flags. They just sort of like not thinking about it. But when you see them in the collected, so I am like with these, I really am speaking to Art World, and I do want to, like I said, like do more digital work that is more accessible and also kind of fun to interact with. And I'm trying to think of, I mean, and like with the activism work, like I, you know, applying like a little bit of the artisticness, you know, making sure that there are these images, and that that there's like this thing that stands out, like as people drive by. Like I just feel like any person who is slightly open to having a conversation about this will see that and say, whoa, that's a lot of people who have died, you know, like that's a you know, that's a lot. And then hopefully they consider the fact that it's planted right under the Confederate flag. So public displays of art, I think, is just like also very important, and like, you know, in like in general, but like also in the activism work that we do. Does that answer your question, Stephanie?
Yeah, it does. And I'll ask if there are any other questions, because I have yet another one that could sit here and chat with you about this. Are there other questions that people want to throw into the chat or ask out loud?
I've got a question for you, Christina. I just want to start out with just congratulating you on that work and the Get Woke film series, and the protest that day. It was really amazing to see all those people there, and it was all, you know, because of your hard work. So it's really cool to hear you talk about your small group that grew and grew and grew. And sort of maybe along the same lines of Stephanie's question, I'm really interested in that relationship between your art practice and how you how it kind of feeds in with your activism. And I wonder if you could talk about like process in making the work, but also process in like developing these events and engaging people in both ways, and maybe plans for the future. Yeah.
Process as far as like the in making of
Yeah,
like
like
the
if your if like that training, having an MFA kind of helps with that at all, or if you see a relationship between like not only outcome, but also like, yeah, how you do it, how you think about it.
Yeah, I really think that going for my MFA like changed a lot of things for me. First of all, it connected me with a community of people that were like thinking about artwork and what was out there currently, and like the issues that were happening globally. And when I started my graduate program, I was just starting this work. Like I was just doing the photographs of myself, expressing myself. I had just started to sort of capture the Confederate flags as like an act um, of like protest, you know, like, I mean, that there's a piece where I'm performing the role of photographer. You want me to see this flag, I'm going to see you. I did start before graduate school. In graduate school, I was encouraged to do more. In graduate school, people were like, are you kidding me that this is what's happening in your community? And Christina, like, this is really, you know, something that you should look into and explore. So the encouragement and being led to, you know, just kind of like content that would support, you know, the work I was doing and help me kind of like see what was happening was really hugely important. Um, with the videos, like I said in the talk, like they were all like based on interviews with people locally, like my white friends and family members, and asking them about like telling me stories that were related to race. Um, and it was like everything has been very organic for me artistically, where I started like capturing these stories, these archives, these things, these photos, you know, obituaries from the historical association, and then I, you know, jumped onto the beer cans and was like, oh, beer cans, and I started to like photograph them in the way that I was photographing myself and photographing the Confederate flags and just kind of like collecting. And from there, realizing that these things were, you know, they're objects, like, you know, photos. Like, what about if I just take this thing and deconstruct it? And so that was disgusting. So going, walking up and down the back roads of Delaware County and, you know, collecting beer cans, because I was already collecting them. When I'd see them, I would be like, okay, like doing my job, picking up trash. But now I was like taking them and giving them a lot of attention and time to sort of think about the rebellion that was occurring. You know, this like you start developing characters of who is driving on that road. Like you're like, oh, I bet you this is a guy who, like, you know, goes to, you know, he takes this road every day on his way home from work, and he's, you know, because there's always like, you know, 6 cans in this location, and there's like, you know, slightly further down the road, a couple miles, he's like chugging, you know, beers and then like chucking them out. And so I construct these pictures of people, and then you start talking to your friends in the community, and they're like, "Oh, I know whose beer that can that is," and you know, it's funny. And so I started deconstructing them, and that became almost like a, once they were clean and able to handle, I cut them in strips, the beer cans into strips, and used some really great scissors and just kind of cut this fringe, and it really engages the knitting brain, like for anybody who knits, where you have to kind of pay attention, but you can look up and you don't have to be fully engaged all the time. As far as the activism, like organizing the activism piece, you know, one of our co-organizers is like she's very experienced in activism and like doing really kind of like unique direct action campaigns. Like one time releasing crickets into the police station in New York City, for example. Um, and so, you know, that creative process, when you have somebody who's wired like that, can be really fun. And with just a few people, you know, meeting, and these things do tend to happen quickly, and you just have to think, you know, like I have a background also in event planning, like from my marketing and like my marketing background. So I do a lot of event planning. So it has become more natural. I probably take for granted the things that I could tell you that about the process, but you know, getting together and just making sure that we have, you know, that we're safe, that we're coming up with something that is going to resonate in some way, that's inclusive, that is getting the message across clearly. And then we often have, you know, somebody who is designated as the person who's going to, you know, be the spokesperson in case the police get, you know, involved. And I'll say that, like, at the Honoring Black Lives rally, the village police were like incredibly generous and very supportive, which was nice, you know. I mean, they approached us before when we were setting up, and they said, you know, do you want us to be do you want us to be close by? Do you want us to stand outside of the event? How you tell us how you want us to engage with the group. And we were like, probably just stand outside, and they were really respectful. So I don't know if I answered you, Lee. I think I answered some of what you asked.
Thank you. Yeah.
So we've got a couple more questions. We have one question from John Byler, all the way from Alabama here tonight. So it's nice to see your face, John. And he's asking, do you have contact information about the Get Woke film series and other like-minded local groups that you could provide? Because he has some other local people who he might like to connect to your work. You're hearing the bath time struggle in the background here.
I'm going to drop the Get Woke, the URL for our website in the chat. Oops, it just went to Joe. Sorry. It just went to Joe Vons.
You can scroll up and click to everyone, and then it will.
I got it. I just didn't know it was set to that.
There it is.
So, and there is it's this website I'm still kind of working on some of the features, but there's a page that has a list of some of the organizations that we work with. Bushel Collective, for example, in Delhi. There's the Young Progressives of Delaware County. We tend to stay pretty localized in Delaware County because it's really got a unique set of issues, in my opinion. I mean, I lived in Oneonta for a number of years, and I feel like it's like very different worlds, so close. I mean, it's like Cooperstown, Oneonta, and Delhi. Like, it could be like 100 miles away from each other, but it's not.
So I think that leads us right into Phil Warish's question that, he's loving the premise that you put on the table to distinguish between acts of activism through the fair and platforms that might make more room for activism through Get Woke. And he's wondering, is there if there's a sense of whether or not the traction of these events has gained due to the legacy or newly arrived populations in Delaware County? And I assume maybe, Phil, you're referring to New York City transplants.
Yes, I think absolutely. I think that part of the surge of people we saw at the Honoring Black Lives was probably folks that who were second homeowners or had recently moved to the area after COVID. It wasn't everybody, and I was actually really shocked by some of the people, the faces that I saw out that day that were local teenagers that were that came. So it was an absolute mix of those people. I've been, for the past couple months, we haven't had our like true season for Get Woke, but we've had a book group that's been meeting, and it's so fascinating because there are about 15 people in the group, and I would say that like maybe 8 of them are like brand new to the area, and just wanting to connect with people and get to know the community and meet other progressive people. So yes, Phil, I think definitely.
Okay, well,
And we do.
No, go ahead.
Our season is about to ramp up here for our programming, and we're doing everything via Zoom, of course. And next week, we're going to have Kyle Bass, who is a playwright, and he'll be doing a reading of some select pieces. And that's on our website. And he's awesome. He's so amazing. He was at Franklin Stage Company. I know I see Phil nodding over there. So, because he lives in Franklin. Franklin Stage Company had presented his play last year, Possessing Harriet, and it was just super powerful story of a woman sort of transitioning through the Underground Railroad and the dialogue that happens between people who are in her best interest. It's So he'll be speaking, doing a reading and question and answer next week.
Great. So we're coming up on the 7 o'clock hour. Do you have any other questions?
I think you went.
And so maybe the question to close with, or Leah, did you have something?
No.
No, okay. I think maybe the question to close with is because we do have quite a few, I mean, we have community members on here, which is great, and people from far afield, but we have our students. And so are there ways in which students can get involved with the work that you're doing, or if they're thinking about planning events or what are ways that students can play a role in sharing their voices and moving this discussion forward?
Yeah, so we just, as we've like collected ourselves after having to kind of shift all of our programming, because we had been on a college campus, so it was a kind of an easy built-in way to connect with students. But right now, like, we just spoke with folks at SUNY Delhi who, students from the Black Student Union who are going to be doing a kind of a memorial wall. And I'm basically, I met with them and we're going to collaborate so that they can have a digital presence also. And I feel like, if students have an interest in this subject and they're interested in using the arts as the tool for having these conversations, like I am open to brainstorm or support whatever programming people have. We want to be involved with students. We want to support them. Like, recently a group from Delaware County, the Young Progressives from Delaware County, and they're all from they're in college, but they all live in different towns throughout the county. And they just formed and invited us to their meeting and said, Christina, we want you guys to come. So we went, and it was wonderful. We're just connecting and knowing that we're there for them, retweeting their tweets and supporting them when they need it. So open to anything. I love brainstorming creative event ideas, and
Great. So that's great. So if you want to be connected to Christina, you can email either Leah Frankel or myself. We've just put our emails into the chat box, and we will have a recording of this, as we noted at the top of the hour. And if you'd like to view this again, you can reach out to Leah or myself, and we can share a recording. But again, I want to thank you, Christina, for this really excellent presentation tonight, and I think a really valuable discussion that we've had over the last bit of time. And with that, I think we can close and say thank you and well wishes. And I think you're getting a few thank yous in the chat. And so thank you again. Wonderful to sort of close our series with a person who is local in our community doing really great work. And for those of you who are not part of our Hartwick community, we'll be organizing another most likely virtual series for the spring semester. So stay tuned to hear more from our department in February.
thank you all.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Christina.